boss on DVE. For those that may somehow not know who you are, you probably caused a few accidents. People driving to work in the morning with Bobby Subgum and the cat.
That was our aim all the time, Rob. We try to make people wreck their cars, and I think we, as far as radio shows go, I think we were number one as far as that goes. But we were right there at the tunnel though, so that really helped a lot. Our building was there, and in the morning it would blind you, because it was a mirrored building, so that helped too. But I don't take anything away from us, but I think that the building helped a whole lot.
Yeah, I think you guys did pretty good, I would say. Yeah, you did a pretty good job over the years. Number one, I think, for many years. So congrats to you and Jim Crenn and all the guys that you worked with. And thank you again for all the laughs you gave us and the music too. And that's what we're here to talk about. A lot of people during this quarantine and this downtime have been, putting these Facebook posts out. I've done it too, about the 10 most impactful albums, or the 10 most influential albums. And found that you're doing something similar but way different. And if for those of you out there that aren't following Scott Paulsen on Facebook, you need to go and do that as soon as you're done watching this video, because he's taking the LP, the classic LPs, and doing a series called On the Turntable, which they're not reviews. I wouldn't call these reviews of, hey, this song was this was the best song on the album, or listen to this fiery guitar solo. I'll let you describe, if you would, what On the Turntable is.
Well, if you are of a similar age as I, and you grew up listening to music on vinyl, some of us held on to those records and for a long time, decades and decades and decades. And each of the albums that I own, and I hate calling albums a collection, each of the albums I own, I play with my toys. I play with my albums. I'm not a collector. It's like they're scratched. They don't sound great. But each of them means something to me, either when I bought it, or who they remind me of, or what I was doing with my life at that time, or musically, they say something to me. Each of them says something different. So what I did to kind of keep my chops going as a writer is, a couple of years ago I decided, all right, we'll do a little writing exercise. And I went to my album shelf, and I just pulled an album off the shelf and put it on the table and said, write about it. And it was fun. So I started putting them on Facebook. So they end up being, I guess if you read them to yourself out loud maybe, or just read them visually, it probably would take you a minute maybe to read. And then some photos of the album. But the great part of it is, Rob, the reaction to people to these things, the posts are incredible. And then the community that goes on between the posters. This person saw this show. Oh, I saw that show. Where were you sitting? Oh, remember that girl? It's fantastic. So I've been in it for a couple of years, and it's a lot of fun. And it has reminded me a lot about music that I hadn't listened to in a while. So that's been good for me too.
And that's a lot of what it has done for us, the people reading it. Is reminding us of music that maybe we had forgotten about, or maybe it's reminding us of music that we should have checked out that we didn't, or maybe we found that we checked out something that we didn't even like before, now we do. And I find that the posts that you write, they're so phenomenal that even if it's about an album that I have no interest in, or wouldn't put on my turntable, I want to read about what you're saying about it, because the context that you put it in. I'll take an album that I do like a lot that you wrote about the other day, the Alan Parsons Project. I thought, okay, where's this going to go? And it went. It's not just about the music or the songs. It's the context of like I say, what it meant, or what it meant in history. Now,
it's interesting how what your perception of not just all art, not just recordings, changes as time goes on. Things that you thought at the time were just these fantastic recordings, years later are tough to listen to, frankly, and other things that you may not have had a great remembrance of or connection with mean something to you now. And I think it's just a natural aging process. But I've rediscovered a lot of records that I had not completely forgotten about. I shouldn't say that. I've got a great memory, but hadn't really thought about in quite a while. And it's like, wow, these are very, very good. So then, you know, you try to connect a story with them, or you try to do some research into them to find out, well, who's on the album? Why is it good? What was the other part about this? I break my own thought right in the middle, because I got to make this point. And I always say this, but I'm going to repeat it. It's in and out of context, okay? Music is in and out of context. I think when the digital age exploded and everything became available, everything, at the same time, it kind of flattened the horizon. It flattened the perspective of a song recorded in 1945 and a song recorded in 1965 and a song recorded in 2015. Unless you know the context in which this music was made, what was going on in the world, what was going on with that person, what was going on with you, the listener, I think that, I'm not saying you don't get it, because that's an awful thing to say, but you don't perhaps feel the same way about it as does a person who experienced these things when they first happened. I'm not old enough to, you know, I was, I'll put it this way, I'm 61, so I was 5 when the Beatles hit. And I have older brothers and sisters, so I remember the Beatles, okay? When they first hit, I remember the Ed Sullivan Show and all that, but I wasn't paying attention to music. My music is, if I had to clarify it, I would say starts about 68, you know, from personal memory, and then on up. And even the stuff I remember as a little kid on the radio, I've now learned more about, but I didn't know that then. I wasn't like I was reading Rolling Stone and Cream magazine and all that stuff, and like I did in my teen years. I wasn't doing that as a little kid. But the point is, you know, when everything's on a flat line, when everything is available to you at once, it all sort of has the same core value, and they really don't have the same core value. It's like saying, you know, Meet the Beatles and Let It Be. Well, it's the same band, so really they have the same value. No, they don't. It's a whole different thing. One is at the very beginning, one's at the very end. There's a whole story that goes on in between, and it might just be, you know, 7 years or so, or 8 years, but it's a lifetime of story. So out of context, I don't know that it means as much. So a long-winded answer to your question, I know, but one of the reasons I do these posts is to try to bring some context back into these recordings that you may have heard of, like Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. I think is probably the most popular album of the rock era, and every single human being knows the logo and knows sort of what the record sounds like. But there are still many, many stories to tell about it, and the more you learn about these things, the more respect I think you have for them.
Absolutely, yeah. Putting things into that it's like history itself. History has a context to it, and things happen, and they happen in a certain sequence, and those things affected what came after them. So that kind of brings us to what you and I had talking about here. You know, we've got all these people. We're posting these things about you know, Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper's and what they meant to us. And I think I asked you a little bit about, you know, what's something maybe that was underrated, or something that was not really, you know, that was under the radar. And you came back with a couple of really interesting titles that I wouldn't even have thought, wow, that's something that was underrated or wasn't thought as highly of at the time, especially as it pertains to, say, Pink Floyd or some of the heavier stuff. I can see how it pertained to your selections, and we'll get to those in a second, how it pertains to some of rock music, but to take that leap to how that influenced, say, Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or things that came after it. And I'll be interested to hear more about, you know, why you picked the two selections you did that were underrated or kind of under the radar, I guess.
Yeah, that's the question was that you asked was, what album should people know about that they maybe don't know about? And when I read that, I thought, wow, that's a great question, because there's got to be hundreds, right? But the very first thing, like the magic 8-ball and the thing that floats up to the surface, the first thing that floated up to the surface of my brain was Graham Parsons. Just the image of Graham Parsons. There are plenty of unknown characters in the history of rock and roll, and I think he's one of the best. He has one of the best stories. So I think people should know about him. And the two albums that really come to mind are both critically acclaimed and somewhat popular today, but they weren't when they came out. And it took them a really long time to become popular. The first one is the Byrds' Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which came out in 1968. And the second came out the following year, actually 9 months later. And it's the first album by the Flying Burrito Brothers, which is Graham Parsons' next band with Chris Hillman, The Gilded Palace of Sin. They're similar records. And the reason I think they're important, and that was the other part of your question, an important album. The reason I think they're both important is at one point in time, the music industry tried to market music as one thing for each person. And I think it began post-war, and it kind of worked its way through rock and roll and on into the 1960s. And people don't listen to just one thing. People don't. Nobody does. If you're asked what kind of music you like, you may say jazz, or you may say blues, or you may say rock, or you may say country. But that isn't all you listen to. Nobody listens to music that well, or I shouldn't say nobody. I should clarify. The majority of people don't listen to music that way. We listen to a lot of different stuff. I mean, on any given day, that's why they put buttons on the radio. You're not going to listen to WYEP every day of the week. You're going to listen to something else at some point in time. It's the same thing with the music that you have at home or on your phone or wherever you keep your music. I'm all over the board. I get bored with stuff really fast. I'm not a great fan of generally opera. Generally, I'm sure that I've seen an opera, heard an opera that I liked, and there are ones that I know from Bugs Bunny cartoons, and there are those that really stick in my head. Carmen is a fantastic opera, but opera is not my ball of wax. So, but I probably listened to just about everything else at one point in time. The music industry didn't get that, especially country music. In the late 50s and early 1960s, country music sales were bottoming out. Rock and roll kids were buying rock and roll records, kids were not buying country records. And so there was this movement in Nashville, maybe starting in 56, 57, somewhere right in there, to make the music coming out of Nashville, the country music, a lot more palatable to your middle of the road suburban couple. So Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley and Floyd Kramer, the pianist, and Boots Randolph, and those folks decided that they would get rid of all the fiddles and the banjos and the honky-tonk music that had made country music extremely popular. And they did. They got rid of everybody. And they started putting out what was later called the new Nashville sound. People also called it countrypolitan. It was like Jim Reeves and I Call for Pizza, Patsy Cline, orchestras, sweet music, the Anita Carr singers, but nothing that you would have ever heard Hank Williams sing. Okay, let's put it that way. You would have Jim Reeves, put your sweet lips a little closer to the phone. You had Ray Charles doing country music. Can't stop loving you, with 128 vocalists in the background. It's not what you would think about when you think about country music. So between 55 and maybe 65, let's say, there wasn't a whole lot of real country music being made. And what do they say about nature? Nature abhors a void. So whenever there's a hole in a market like that, somebody's going to fill that because there's money to be made and just creatively. Well, strangely enough, it wasn't the folks in Nashville who filled it. It was rock and rollers who filled it. The rock and rollers who had begun as folk artists in LA, people like Jim McGuinn, later Roger McGuinn, Barry McGuire, John Phillips, David Crosby, Gene Clark, Bob Dylan. They were folkies and they were bluegrass guys and girls. And they would get up on stage at the Troubadour and places like that in LA when they had Hootenanny nights. This is like 1963, 1964, and the Beatles hit. And some of these guys became famous. And the way they became famous is all of the American record companies suddenly were like, oh crap, we have to have a Beatles. The Beatles, that's what's going on. We have to have a Beatles. Everybody got to get a Beatles. Columbia got a Beatles, and MCA got a Beatles, and RCA got a Beatles, and TV got a Beatles. They got the Monkees, they were their Beatles. Everybody had a Beatles. Let's go get a Beatles. Well, Roger McGuinn and Gene Clark and Chris Hillman, all bluegrass players, all folk players, David Crosby, they're playing together in Los Angeles, and they form a band, and the band's called the Byrds. Record company executive hears them, sees them, signs them, and they are going to be the new Beatles. Now, most people who think of the Byrds, if they think of the Byrds, will think of to everything, turn, 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 you know, bing, 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 hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, right? Or 8 Miles High, or Chestnut Mare, or whatever, you know, whatever Byrds radio song you think of. But the band The Byrds was actually a whole lot of other things. If you listen to their albums, you hear country, you hear Western swing, you hear certainly Beatlesque London music. I mean, Gene Clark, he could have been in the Beatles, the songs that he wrote. The fun thing to do with Byrds albums, fun thing that I like to do, is listen to them and imagine them being sung with British accents, because a lot of those songs are just straight Beatles ripoffs. It's like, feel a whole lot better when we're gone, when we're gone. But Gene Clark was a tremendous singer, tremendous songwriter. So they get their deal, and they're the new Beatles. And what happens is they start leaning, should I say, country. They do get harder, they do play psychedelic music, but they also every once in a while will sneak a folk song in there, a country song in there. Eventually, the Byrds split up. Crosby goes to form a band with Steve Stills and Graham Nash, and Gene Clark doesn't want to be a rock star anymore. He wants to go back to playing bluegrass, so he does a couple albums with Doug Dillard. So when he reforms his band, Roger McGuinn, through Chris Hillman, gets turned on to this guy named Graham Parsons. And Graham Parsons was a trust fund kid. He came from money, and he went out to Los Angeles to be a rock star. He's going to get discovered. And he worked really hard at it. And he had a lot of talent, and it all worked for him because he got an audition with the Byrds. He made it into that band, and he went on tour. And during the tour, Roger McGuinn said to him, got a new idea for a new album. I want to do the history of American music. I'm going to take it from minstrel shows all the way through the blues, all the way through country, all the way through rock and roll, blah, blah, blah. We'll get all the way double album, and at the end we'll have all this keyboard music, all this ARP synthesizer stuff, and this is 1967, 68. So Graham Parsons says, yep, great idea. They go in the studio to make this album, and little by little, Graham Parsons starts pushing the whole thing country. And he keeps bringing in songs, and he keeps making suggestions, and he wins Chris Hillman's love, basically. So now it's Hillman and Parsons pushing Roger McGuinn over the country cliff. And they do. And the album they record fits right in the hole that all the folks in Nashville created by getting rid of all the fiddles and banjos. The only problem is it's being played by long hairs. This is 1968. Keeping things once again in context. To have hair any longer than the hair I'm wearing right now, certainly no beard, 1968. If you had a beard, you were a radical. And if you had hair any longer than this, you were trouble to the establishment. And there was an establishment. So that history lesson aside, the Byrds can't get a sniff of the country market. They can't get any country station to play their record. They can't get any rock station to play their record because it's a country record. So nobody ends up hearing the record. Critics like the record. Let me show you the record. Critics like the record, This is what it looks like. Very cool cover, very cool record.
Yeah.
And there's lots and lots and lots of other stories about the record that I could take up your time with, but I don't want to be that boring. I'll just tell you that because this record was made, not because it was popular, not because it sold, but because it was made, the people in the music industry that were thinking about using their country roots on a rock and roll record were now freed to do so. And that record, and certainly the first band, the band record, and the Bob Dylan stuff that was coming out at that time, Blonde on Blonde, Nashville Skyline, that sort of thing, opened the door for every country rock band to follow, including the West Coast sound, the Eagles. The Eagles were a bluegrass band. They came from bluegrass roots. Ooh, Midnight Flyer, Engineer, Won't You Let Your Whistle Moan. I mean, that's the third album. You know, even by that time, they're still playing bluegrass. So all of that started in these folk clubs in California. Most of it started in folk clubs in California and Texas. So that's the first album. Well, these guys, because Graham Parsons was so pushy about getting the country record out, it rubbed Roger McGuinn the wrong way, from what I've read, and this led to that band busting up again. McGuinn would form another Byrds after that, but Graham Parsons and then later Chris Hillman left the Byrds and they formed this band called the Flying Burrito Brothers. And unfortunately, fortunately, it's a fantastic band with mostly great recordings. Similar, I always compare that band, the Flying Burrito Brothers, I always compare them to the Faces because same time period and they basically led the same lifestyle. So their music was a little ragged because their lifestyles were a little ragged. And they could get away with it because it was the time and it's what they did. So they got away with it. Cheers to them. Way to go. Here. Cheers to them. So anyway, the Flying Burrito Brothers, please do. The Flying Burrito Brothers weren't exactly disciplined, but they turned out a really great album. And this was the first of many to come of an album that it's called The Gilded Palace of Sin. I know it's a little shiny there. So came out in 1969, and it answers the question of, can you like both country and rock? And if you do, why does it have to be two different kinds of music? Why can't it just be one? And that's what that record did. And so, you know, Pure Prairie League, The Outlaws, Leonard Skinner, name whatever Southern rock band you want to name. I realize Southern rock is a little more blues based than this is, but same feel, same genre, are allowed to happen and allowed to be popular, including having a budget from a record company and a budget from a touring company and that sort of thing, having money behind you so you can become popular. None of that happened without those two records. And so that's why I think they're kind of underrated. But all that history aside, you should just get it, listen to it, and get off on it, because it sounds great. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to know. It's okay. The Alan Parsons Project album that you mentioned that I posted, iRobot. I don't know a freaking thing about that record. I mean, I know the name. I mean, I've read the names. They're on the album, but I don't recognize anybody. There's only one person on the album I recognize, and that was the guy that sang For the Hollies. Now, he's only on one song. So I don't even know what I know that Alan Parsons was a great engineer who worked with the Beatles and worked with Queen, but I got the whole history. But as far as like who's on the album, doesn't matter to me. Doesn't matter. That's the great thing about music. You don't have to know anything about it. But I fell down this rabbit hole, 45 years ago, and I haven't been able to escape. I want to know as much as I can know. But all that aside, it doesn't matter. Just go get these records or download them and play them, because no matter what people thought at the time, they're great and they're still with us, and they'll be with us forever, hopefully.
Wow, what a fantastic, phenomenal description of both of those records. And I was asking you at the beginning how did these records impact other records, and you talked about the doors that they open for other types of music to combine country and rock. And I even think of bands. My introduction really to Graham Parsons was more so when I discovered bands like Sun Volt and the old 97s.
Oh,
because
yeah.
that's who they kept referring to Graham Parsons. I got to check this guy out. And so I can hear, when I went back and I listened to these records, I could hear stuff, I could hear Graham Parsons. I can hear it in the old 97s and Sun Volt and those all country bands, Lucinda Williams, those types of things. What I heard in that music was
I really
still there
like
today.
the
You're absolutely correct.
sound of Memphis, the Memphis music of the 60s and 70s, among my favorite stuff. And Graham Parsons uses that quite a lot. You can hear a lot of those Stax Volt records, those, Booker T and the MG, that feel to it. On top of the country and on top of the, it's like I said, people don't listen to just one kind of music. And this guy obviously got that. And it reminds me of hip hop, to be honest with you. And it has nothing to do with it musically, but the process in which nothing is out of consideration. It's like you could use anything as long as it fits the feel of the song. We don't care where it comes from. We'll figure out the credits later. Just bring it in and do something with it. And I think that began before the Flying Burrito Brothers, but certainly. But I think that they used it better than most bands I've heard. They'll throw something in. I think the band is probably the best at doing that. There's like all these off style instruments, it's like a tuba out of nowhere. It's like, wait a minute, what? But it works. It works. It's like, it's like AC/DC record with all of a sudden a bagpipe solo in the middle of it. It's not supposed to be there, but it works. So I think the Flying Burrito Brothers are kind of that way for me, especially like, pedal steel guitar and the Grateful Dead also did that, but a little later on. But these guys are just a phenomenal band, and I hope that maybe a few people watching this will pick that up and take a listen to it.
And that's really what I've kind of hoped to accomplish with some of these videos that I'm working on, is just I like to help expose people to music that maybe they would not otherwise get to hear, and at least go out and listen to it. If you don't like it, okay, turn it off, don't listen to it again, but maybe you'll hear something that you go, wow, man, I wish I'd have heard that 10 or 15 years ago. And that's what I was hoping to bring out in this discussion with you is, what are some things that, that people should know about that they don't. And so I would bet that some people will go back and after hearing this or seeing this. And have you done it On the Turntable on either of those? I cannot recall.
I have. I've done both in the past at one point in time. I remember I did a piece about nudie suits, which are the sort of country western crazy jumpsuit wear that you see on the cover of this record. I mean, look at this guy's. That's Graham Parsons. He's got marijuana all over his jacket, and it's just these jackets, these suits, these leather jumpsuits, basically these leather suits, were made by a guy whose name was Nudie, and he made these by hand, one at a time. They were very expensive, and they became very, very popular among the Conway Twitty Porter Wagner set in Nashville in the mid '60s, the late '60s, early '70s. Porter Wagner and Dolly Parton on TV. Get a box of Breeze, and you can get yourself a nice tea towel. Anyway, nudie suits. What was I talking about? Oh, that's what I was talking about on the post. Nudie suits. And then I did another post later on with Sweetheart of the Rodeo, in which I talked about Graham Parsons' death, which is a whole nother insane story, which you don't have time to hear. But at some point in time, look that up on your interweb, because it's an insane, crazy story.
Well, and I would recommend that everybody go out and pull up those posts, the On the Turntables for these two albums, because you'll give the context. The listener can listen to the music and take that context and probably, I bet it enhances the enjoyment of listening to something that they've never heard before. Because again,
and add to it too. I mean, that's the best part. The best part about Facebook is the fact that people, they have opinions about things too, and I go back and forth with people all the time. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. And this has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate you asking me to do this.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it too. It's been a lot of fun for me. And I'll give you one other thing I want to ask about it, and we didn't talk about it earlier. Your wife, Kit, does some paintings.
She does. She does. Kit, my wife, is a painter, an amazing painter, and it's really interesting house we live in, just to sit and, you know, have this going on in front of you. It's like you watch these pieces that she creates and how she does it. It's very, very interesting to watch, and she's so into it. It makes her happy, makes other people happy. And she's on Facebook as well. You can look her up, Kit Paulsen, KITPAULSEN, and check out her artwork. Yeah, it's beautiful. Our house is filled with crazy fun art, and you see some behind us. And, yeah, we have a good time.
Yeah, so a lot of creativity coming out of the house. Anything else? Any other projects or anything? Is there a website that you want to direct people to, or anything that you want to talk about? That
No,
you have
you know, I'm in the midst of thinking about doing this On the Turntable thing as a book of some sort, but it's in its very early stages, and I have a lot of material to work with. So each and every day I put up a new post, and that seems to keep me off the streets. That and the coronavirus. but we're doing well, and I hope everybody else is. Cheers.
Oh, well, yeah, we hope that you guys are good. Cheers. We hope you guys are, you know, stay safe and stay healthy down there. We miss you up here in Pittsburgh. We wish we had you in the mornings. Again, we thank you for all the fun and the comedy. And you saw some bad hockey throughout those years too. You saw some good hockey, but you were on a lot during some of the bad hockey, I think, in the 80s. And so you're a Pittsburgher, and good.
We got it all. We saw many cups, and we saw many years when there were no cups, and it was all fun.
Yep.
It was all great.
Yep. But you guys were there to help celebrate that as well. So thank you very much, Scott. I'll let you go for the evening. Maybe we'll have you back sometime again to talk about another deep subject if you feel like it at some point. But again, go out Scott Paulsen at Facebook, and you've got to follow Scott and check out the On the Turntable article. Scott, thank you very much. Say hi to Kit for us from Pittsburgh, and that's it from here. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. It was fun.